Right, so next up is Professor van Alphen, who, like me, is an alien. He's not a Finno-Scandinavian, as the rest of us in this room, I think, are. But unlike me, he's an ecologist. But the lady before, Asa, before lunch was talking about the importance of multidisciplinarianism in how we approach our problems. And it's great, I think, that we've got an ecologist here. So welcome.
And thanks a lot for being invited here. It's a wonderful conference and very well organized. And what I want to do in the next 15 minutes is to explain you a little bit about a case on animal welfare that received a wide press in the Netherlands. And I think rumors even reached Finland, the reason I'm here. But before I do so, I want to give you a sort of background about how we work in the Netherlands. I am an ecologist, but I am also a member of the Council of Animal Affairs that since 25 years advises the government on animal welfare, either on animals that are kept or used in research, but also on wild animals. And one of the problems that we have is that there are two laws that relate to animal welfare. One is the Conservation Act, and the other is the Animal Act. And the Conservation Act says that, in principle, you keep your hands off wild animals. You let them live their lives, then they are happy. And the Animal Act says, no, people have a general duty of care if they are responsible for, say, a nature reserve or an area. And there is some tension between that. And since we have very active people in the Netherlands that like to play things hard, they go to court and they use the difference between those laws to make people that try to manage a nature reserve lives a little bit harder. And there are other things that are not very clear. For instance, both laws, they mention literally the intrinsic value of animals, which is very nice, but because it says that we should respect the inherent individuality of wild animals, but and in wild animals that would be non-intervention then. But the same problem comes back, and intrinsic value is sometimes a very difficult thing to use because it's not a measurable quantity. So you cannot compare species. And very often in nature management, you have to decide whether you will save the fox or the birds or something like that. And there's no way you can decide that. And in general, people have the idea that they have a sort of a system of value for animals. Smaller animals that have shorter generation times, for some reason they receive less care. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I can understand it as an ecologist, but I just bring up the point that philosophically it's a problem. And at the basis of all these problems is many people have this old romantic idea that stems from Rousseau, that man cannot improve nature, and that the nature brings itself into a balance. As an ecologist, I know that's not true. But, and the other thing is then you have to manage nature, and certainly in the Netherlands, because in the Netherlands, the reserves are very often small, and they're isolated from similar habitats, and they're incomplete ecosystems, and they're often vulnerable to all sorts of pollution from the outside. So the problems that we have, they are basically that you cannot draw a line. So all the problems that we have, they play along this axis, and very often we do not know exactly where we are. So what we do now is also, because often problems with wild animals are very different because the animals are so different, that we say, well, we'll use at least a flow diagram so that always we think about these things in the same orderly way. And I'm not going to walk you through the whole thing, but I want you to point to this last one that says that the impact should be acceptable. And what is acceptable is also determined by the general public. And with that, I think I can start with the case study you all have invited me for. And that's an area which is called the Oostvaardersplassen. And I'll show it on a map. What you see at the left side, you see the city of Amsterdam, and then you see an old inland part of the North Sea, where the Dutch people have built polders, and you see this large polder, which is the most recent one that was made in the 60s. And it has become a nature reserve. I explain how that works. And the reason is that it has lots of marsh birds that are protected by European law. And so we have the duty to protect those birds and make sure that their population numbers are as indicated in the Europe 2000. So the history of this area is quite interesting. So the polder was created in 1960s, and in 1967 the water receded and it became land. But the most western area, it was a little bit lower, and so there was shallow water still. There were lots of marsh birds there, and then we had a hot, dry summer in '75, and then lots of those birds died because of botulism, and then people were forced to bring cold water in the area, which increased the marsh area, and then it became about 600 hectares, and it still is. And the problem was that it was filling up with reeds, but that lots of grey-leg geese came to molt, and they would feed on the reeds and helping the marshland to stay open, but there were not enough grey-leg geese. So the people argued then that there was also a drier part where there was grassland, which slowly was turning into forest, and that they needed large herbivores to have the grassland there, which would make the area more attractive to the geese. Then we would have more geese, and then we could manage the marshland. That was the idea. So here you see the grey-leg geese. And then what happened was that the first manager, or the manager, the most important manager, still is the State Forestry Service, and it decided at some point it wanted to have that reserve managed as least as possible. They wanted natural processes to play a role. And so the problem is if you do that if you don't regulate populations by predators or by hunting, then in the end, the animals are limited by food. And that results in large mortality due to starvation during the winter, and that's what happened. So here we go. So it became officially a nature reserve in '86. In '84 they had introduced 18 Konig horses, and in '92 they had added 44 red deer, and there were Hackerin cattle, and they had realized already at that point that the area could sustain about 500 red deer. And I, as an ecologist, have always thought it was very strange that they did this, because there were already examples in the literature that if you don't manage a deer population, then it will grow until all the food is gone. And so in 2018, when all this bad press came about the problem, there were more than 3,000 red deer. And in the meantime, the reserve had really become a steppe. All the trees had disappeared. And so it didn't look like a nice area anymore. And then in the winter of 2018, 3,000 animals died, horses, deer, and cattle alike. And so the general public didn't like that idea, and they started to protest. So farmers illegally entered the reserve, and they started to feed the starving animals. And we didn't like that, because if you have no regulation by food, then the next year you would have even more animals that would be hungry and have a bad life. So I had already been on an advisory committee in 2009, and to say that the population size should be reduced by active culling. But that was not followed up at the time. And that could have prevented overgrazing and deterioration of the environment. So now the current advice is that they finally reduce all the number of large herbivores, and that they restore the environment, making a shelter for the animals against the cold winds in winter. And but you have to reset the populations of the herbivores, and also that you have to improve the marsh area, because after all, this whole area is built for marsh foal. That's the aim, and all these grazers are only an instrument to reach that. So it was very difficult to defend that all these animals were going to be shot. And so we had to decide what should happen. So of course, we have considered taking those animals out and bring them elsewhere. And with the horses, you can do that, because the conics, they are sort of domesticated animals, and you can collect family groups and bring them to other places, which is not very stressful. But with the deer, it would be an enormous problem. They cannot travel for 50 hours in a vehicle, and that would have led to stress, injury, and mortality. We have considered anti-conception, but that was not a good idea either, and so we decided for culling. And if you do the calculations, you can see that if you stop having all these animals to grow in endless numbers, and then you can stop killing every single year 1,500 of them. If you keep the population at 500, you need only to kill 200. So in the long term, we kill far fewer animals than with the old way of doing the system. And so then we could finally face all these people that were so angry. And the situation is now that we have transported the horses, we have killed the deer, and the marsh will be restored, and the general public has now accepted what we are doing, also because there's better communication now, and that's what I wanted to tell.
Has anybody got any questions or comments they would like to make?
Okay.
Yes, there's a gentleman towards the back.
Oh.
Thanks for the very interesting talk. It's very nice. I think your last point was quite important, how you finished, like you have better communication now to the public. How did you do that? So
Yeah,
there's still like lots of protests.
It was in the past. It was always done by the Forestry Service. They have all these press releases, and but they were sort of by the public. It was decided that those were the wicked people. So we could not rely anymore on that. But the good thing was that because there was so much attention for the problem, lots of journalists came to talk to other people, and so a lot of people working in the field of conservation, nature conservation, or in the field of animal welfare, then were interviewed. And so that they could explain that you have to do something, and that this would be the least damaging of all the options. And I think that slowly has seeped into the general public's mind.
Thanks.
Yes, and that was one of the first points you made about public opinion, but public opinion can change. And if we're making plans for things and we're trying to reflect public opinion, we're always likely to be behind.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what we've done now is, because the council exists this year 25 years, so we have written a book explaining not only this case, but how we approach animals in nature in general. We're discussing several options, the way, for instance, we deal with seals in the Netherlands, which is a problem because sick seals, they come on the beaches and the people don't like to see them dying. But if you help them and you cure them and you bring them back in nature, then because their immune system doesn't work, they become ill again, etc. So that's really a problem. The wolf has come back in the Netherlands, which is also giving a lot of emotional responses. So we use all those examples to explain how we want to deal with animals in nature. And I think now this book is there as a general sort of attitude to how to do this, and that helps.
Great. Anybody else? Behind.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Do you think the public understands the difference between animal welfare and animal ethics? Because you could claim that a good, like a euthanasia or a kill could be not a problem from an animal welfare point of view if it's done properly.
Yeah.
But then there's the moral
Yeah,
issue that should we really intervene and should we kill? And do you think that's something that's mixed together in the debate, or is it clear?
It was mixed together very much, because all the people that opposed people starving from hunger in winter, the moment that we said there is a solution, and the solution is that we're going to cull, then they immediately became emotional about the fact that they would be culled. And so those are two different things. And it took quite some time to explain that culling in itself can improve animal welfare.
And Mike, could you be quick? But Mike's got a question. Sorry, Mats. Maybe you can ask in coffee break. I've been ordered to invite Tom to ask a question. Tom.
Thank you. Well, as you described on the slide up there, you are you're feeding extra if they become, in average, become too skinny. Or but what about in the even in the summer times, animal that need some special care due to injuries or maybe to heavy parasite attacks? Do you kill them as well, or do you give them? Do you worming them, or how do you do that?
There is always proactive culling when animals are in a bad condition in other times of the year, or whether they're parasite-ridden, or we'll do that.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to you.
Thank you.